Nick Foster is a designer who has worked at places you might have heard of before, such as Sony and Dyson and Nokia and Apple. And he was notably head of design at Google X, which is Google's moonshot factory. Um, he's known for his work on speculative design, design fiction, his coining of the term future mundane, and his co-founding of the Near Future Laboratory. In 2021, he was awarded the title of Royal Designer for Industry, which I discovered is actually limited to just 200 people at any point in time. And I should note that in total, there are about 150 to 200 descendants and spouses of the House of Windsor. So royal designer, by this American's account, actually is, for all intents and purposes, actual royalty. But it is, in all seriously, it's a true achievement, and I'm honored to have Nick here. So welcome, Nick.
Well, thank you very much. That's a very glowing start. Nice to see everyone as well. I appreciate everyone's time is valuable, so I do appreciate you making time to jump on this yammer, and we'll try and make it as useful as possible. But
Yeah.
yeah, nice to be here.
So I thought it might be fun to start a bit with your background. So you grew up in Derby, UK, and I was wondering if that contributed to any kind of your design evolution or your thinking.
So step one is pronunciation. We need to work on our pronunciation here. So it
Okay.
might have an E in it, but it's pronounced Derby, just to be
Derby. Okay,
clear.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Yeah, Derby is a small town. It's like a damp sort of Midlands town in the middle of the UK, where I was born and raised. And it's the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. So it's the place where the first mechanized mill was actually, mechanized factory was built by John Lom. And since then, it's been basically a good place to make stuff. It's been an engineering town for a long time, and it continued that way. My grandfather worked in engineering and manufacturing. My father worked on the railways, and that also sort of took a nosedive in the 80s around the Maggie Thatcher's conservative government, and the privatization of the railways, most notably. So yeah, I grew up there. I grew up around a lot of sort of engineers, makers, folks that like to smash metal into different shapes. So it definitely piqued my interest, the idea that you could make things from scratch. And I was lucky enough to sort of feed my curiosity and that into design, and studied design in London. And then went to work for James Dyson in the early days in the 90s. So that was my sort of start on my trajectory towards being a professional designer.
Is Derby still like a large place for manufacturing?
A lot less now. I think it's the same as like a lot of large manufacturing cities, like Detroit in the US. It's gone through its own decline, and it's trying to sort of reinvent itself in the new financial economy. But yeah, Derby is just one of those places that was built off the back of manufacturing, and then when manufacturing changed or moved away, it didn't quite know what it was. I think Derby, you wouldn't call it like a depressed city, but it's definitely sort of lower than middle, in terms of its sort of median income.
I see. Do you think this experience had any say in your development of this idea of future mundane? Like, is Derby a mundane city? Like, not,
Yeah, I would
like
say. I mean, for those of you who don't know what the future mundane is, I can just give a quick kind of overview. It's a way of me sort of pushing back at the early version of me, which is when I was a young designer working kind of futures work. I did all of that energetic, thirsty sort of futures work that was very escapist and heroic and sort of overtly futuristic. And it just didn't feel very genuine to me. And every time I went back home to visit my mum and dad, it just felt like I was living in a sort of fantasy world where clients were really happy and they were getting these cool renderings and these great movies and these brilliant 3D things. And then I'd go home and go for a pint with my dad at the social club. And it just didn't feel like it dovetailed in any way. So I wrote an essay, I think in 2013, called The Future Mundane for Core 77, which is like a industrial design blog that I think is still going. And it sort of stuck with a lot of people, and I've developed that thesis for a long time now, and it's sort of stuck around with me for quite a long time. That idea of thinking about the future as a normalized, lived-in place, and trying to bring those memories of my early childhood and my father's life today. He still lives in Derby. He's not moved from 50 miles in 82 years. So he's lived and born and raised in that place. And I always try and think back to that place, and ground all of my ideas about the future in those experiences. So I think for the first part of my career, I just got trapped in the normal traps of being a futurist, and it just felt disingenuous. So I wanted to lean a bit more heavily in the world that I came from, you know.
Yeah. So you mentioned that it's the city was the start of the Industrial Revolution. Um, do you so this is more of a kind of a speculative question, I suppose. Do you think that the idea of futurism can really only exist? Like, could it have only existed post-industrial revolution? That something about the pace of progress actually is what kind of induces futurist thinking.
I mean, that's a huge, huge subject, but I think I would go a bit further back, perhaps. I think there's just this general sense of mechanization, modernism, and then industrial revolution that comes sort of through all of that. The idea of the world as a place of technocratic and technologic progress. And I think because technologic progress is accretive, it piles on the past. I write a bit about this in the book. Like, once one generation has developed something like the internal combustion engine, the next generation doesn't have to do that. It already exists. So then they can do turbochargers, or they can do gearboxes, and then the next generation can do something else on top of that. And so in that way, the pace of sort of industrial progress tends to accelerate, I think. And as such, I think it means that change accelerates, and a lot of the change that we experience in our lives is driven by technology. And so our notion of like, well, where is all this heading and what might it all lead to, that interest starts to get piqued. And I think our interest in the future starts to grow as we see more possibility and more challenges ahead of us opening up more rapidly. I'm not a historian, and I like the history of thinking about the future, but I wouldn't say I'm an expert in the territory at all. But I do feel like one of the biggest sort of change lubricants has been the sheer amount of invention and technological change that we've experienced.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting, this idea of like having this kind of base technology that people can build on, right? And you stand on the shoulder of giants, and you can just looking at like what it is that humans have accomplished like now, versus just a few hundred ago is it's pretty astounding. But then also at the same time, like we get into these, like, I don't know, maybe like local minima. Like there's this famous story about Google like spending all this effort optimizing like the shade of blue on a link or something, right? It's like you go to the supermarket and there are probably more types of toothpaste than you really need. Like those sorts of things. Like it's not clear in my head like what sorts of activities like kind of gets this sort of incremental improvement versus like the big kind of steps, right? Like the big jumps. Yeah, do you have any thoughts on that from your experience in
Not
Google and
really. I wonder if anyone else does, but not really. I think it's yeah, it's a difficult one to answer actually. I don't have a strong take on that really.
yeah. Yeah, does anybody else have any thoughts on that question? Like why is some improvement incremental? Like why do we sometimes make big leaps?
I think sometimes
Silent room, silent room. Look at that.
Yeah, Paul?
that's the beauty of innovation, right? I think sometimes we don't know those small increments build up to bigger changes over time, essentially.
Hmm.
Our understanding of looking back at those small increments.
Yeah, and we
Yeah.
sometimes don't know what a big step is until we look backwards either. Things can feel like small changes, and the actual implications of those small changes is what the actual change is, not the thing itself. Somebody could invent something and everyone looks at it and goes, well, why is that interesting? And then 10 years later, you realize it's had a fundamental shift on. I think the thing that I want to be really careful about, and being this sort of middle-aged white man from Silicon Valley, it's very tempting for people to sort of say, he's a technocrat and he's only interested in technological change. The only reason I talk about technology is it feels like it's the biggest spinning force at the moment, changing all of the other things that I also care about, which is culture and society and climate and the way we live and all of these sort of habitual things as well. And so I think the reason I talk about technology so much is it does feel like it's had the largest leverage effect on change. Not that I'm sort of a technocrat or somebody obsessed with technology as the sole driver of change on Earth, but it does feel like it's led to more change than many other things of late. And that's why I think it's important when we look at technology. A lot of the people I've worked with, really smart people, when you show a new piece of technology or a new piece of technology appears in the lab, a lot of people are really good at talking about what it is. A lot of people are really good at talking about what they might make with it. Not very many people are very good at talking about what it might mean. And I think that's the part that we're all really quite bad at. And I think that's the bit when you, as Paul said, that's the bit that that's where the change really happens. That's when people's daily lives and their habits and the sneakers they choose to wear and the music they choose to listen to, that's where all that stuff starts to change. It's not the thing itself. It's not the gigaflops and terabytes that matters. It's the behavioral shifts and the societal shifts and the cultural shifts, which is certainly my take on it anyway.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Now I see why you smiled, Paul, when I said Derby, because I heard your English accent.
I'm a Manc.
There you go. Good lad.
I also think that unlike in the 70s, where computers first became available, the technology is way more accessible. You can pay $20 a month for ChatGPT, whereas, not many people have access to those large computers that cost tens of thousands of dollars. And now you have hundreds of millions of people, touching GPT technology, be able to be creative and be able to figure out like, hey, what can I do with this now?
Yeah, and I think, yeah, you're right. Accessibility of technology is important, but I think we should all be very careful of technology, as we refer to it in the present, is only ever a small thing. But technology at some point was almost everything. Sharp sticks were technology once, and ink was technology once. And the fact we're talking about sort of artificial intelligence and machine intelligence is because it's sort of hot right now. And I think that we've got to be careful when we talk about technology, I think. That we just sort of talk about the right now, the very, very edge of it, the bit that's from last week. And I actually think that technology writ large takes a very long time to actually become mass adopted, that whole overused trope of the future's here, it's just not evenly distributed. I actually think that there are still, you go to Japan, people use a lot of fax machines still. It's still an existing part of culture, and that's still technology in a very modern, developed, affluent country. Fax machines for some reason have just hung around a long time. So when I talk about technology, I like to try and think about it like as broadly as possible. That's not a critique, by the way. I'm just sort of, I get very sort of twitchy when people talk about technology because it tends to bracket one or two things as opposed to the sort of whole expanse of human endeavor,
Yeah, definitely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to pivot a little bit to your book, Could, Should, Might, Don't, How We Think About the Future. So I'll give just like a quick overview of the four different categories, and then there's a fifth section in which you kind of present your own notion of how we should be thinking about the future. So I'll do a quick overview, and then you should correct me, and you should elaborate on what I'm saying. So this is definitely abbreviated. Okay. So the could category. Oh, like one thing too is like when I was reading this, the entire time I was thinking, oh, which category am I in? Like, what is Nick going to say about me? So it's almost like the personality trait things, right?
Somebody said that. Is it Myers-Briggs? Yeah. Somebody said, is that what? And to be clear, that's absolutely not what I'm trying to do. I think in all these four categories, I find myself in all of them at different times, even throughout one day. And I guess the overarching thing I want people to take away from this is I didn't try and write a book which was some sort of personality test or some framework that you should follow at work or whatever. It's just to try and point out some caricatures that I think we all fall into and we can all recognize in our colleagues and in our friends and in our families. And the reason I've drawn out those corners of the map is to say, that we should sort of be doing all four of them all the time for something that I would consider to be a balanced, rigorous piece of futures work. I don't think that happens. What I think happens is we find ourselves drawn into one of these four channels. So just as a prompt to say, if you want to do some more rigorous futures work, try and think about the other three that maybe you're not thinking about at the moment. That's as far as it goes in terms of a method,
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Let me go through these, and I actually do have a question about that. But okay.
Sure.
So could. So the could people are hopeful visionaries. They devour science fiction is a phrase that you have in the book. Should people are confident idealists. They believe the future is theirs to define. Might people are thoughtful analysts. They embrace uncertainty, discuss plurality, and constantly reassess. And don't people are critical realists. They're drawn to negative consequences, potential collapses, and dystopian tales. So I actually, well, okay. So first off, yeah, is that do you think that's like a good like very brief Cliff Notes kind of
Yeah, I
version of it?
think you did it better than I could because I know too much about it. I have a habit of wandering when I'm defining this stuff. So you did a very good pithy version. So well done.
Thank you. Thanks. So I placed this into the Zoom chat if anybody wants to just just have like a
Oh, that would
visual.
be good. That would be good for me as well. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Um, so I actually think of these as they're kind of like archetypes or like Platonic, maybe ideal like has a kind of like a value judgment to it, but like a Platonic like something or other, like a pure version of a thing, and of course like nothing is actually like a pure version of the thing. So that I think that matches the way that you think about it. Is that right?
Yeah, although I do think without wanting to name names, I think I've definitely found people that are right at the corners of that map that I talked about and
Yeah.
just love and believe in one of these ways of being and just can't sort of move out of that way of being. So I do think, even though they're caricatures, caricatures exist for a reason that every now and then you bump into a kind of a thoroughbred version of these. I think the
Hmm.
vast majority of us wander our way between all of these ways of thinking. And that's sort of beneficial, but I don't think we do them all the time and think that's where the weakness is.
Hmm. Sure. Yeah. My next question actually was, did you have people in mind when you were working these out?
I
But
am I'm
I
not going there. That is a it's not a
fair
but I
enough.
think
Fair
I
enough.
mean there are weirdly I think they do sort of tether to kind of job descriptions would be a loose way of saying it. I think there are certain career paths that lead you to think about the future through certain lenses. And I think we can all sort of see ourselves in each of these from depending on where we've been trained or the way that we see the world. There are very empirical people who trust their data and their statistics and their algorithmic modeling. There are very kind of skeptical people. There are people
Mhm.
who are more sort of uncertain about the future and keen on scenarios. There are people who are excitable and visionary and, G'd up about the future. So I think depending on what you study at college and what you do in your day job, I think that does shape your tendencies for each of these four ways of seeing the future.
Yeah, yeah. I think that makes sense. I mean, I even in my own life, like I've spent a recently I spent a lot of time in academia, and then now I'm in a software startup, and just like the selection mechanism for like those two sorts of things is so different that the people are very different. But it does like being in the startup environment, like it does like make you think about like solving problems like in a different way than if you have to like spend a semester on it and write a paper or something.
Yeah.
Paul?
Me again. Um, I was actually talking to my wife about the context of the book. Um, could, should, might, don't, the archetypes we just discussed there. And she really interestingly made a parallel about the Moscow framework, which is used in military to try and predict futures as well and assess risks and things. I wondered when you were writing the book, was that something that was even in your headspace? Was that something you'd even come across in sort of project management tools at corporate companies? Was that,
Not
yeah,
really. I have one of the no is the answer. The when I said not really, what I meant was no. I've got a sort of maybe to a fault, a kind of fear and a distrust of models, which is which is why when I talk about the book, I'm very kind of a little bit over sort of defensive about accidentally creating some sort of framework or something. And I think the reason is I've just seen it those kinds of things deployed so clumsily so often. Not that they're inherently bad. I think any kind of structure that helps you think can be useful to a lot of people. I think Stuart Candy calls them intellectual prostheses, which they're kind of good things to lean on or get a meeting or a program or a project headed in the right direction. I've never really used them in my work, and I find sometimes meetings or projects can turn more into the method than the actual thinking about the future stuff. So yeah, I'm not very well versed on the latest hexagons or cones or matrices or pyramids or whatever is sort of the moment. But it sounds like what you're describing is actually older than that, but I'm not familiar with it, no.
You mentioned before that you think at any point in time, like there needs to be kind of a blend of these of people working in with these four different mindsets, and like in an organization. Have you thought about like what exactly that blend should look like depending on the organization, or like maybe it should like how it should change over time?
I mean, every single person that comes up with any statement about how things should or do go is blinded by their own experience. And I've only worked in a handful of companies. I've worked in a lot of different projects in those companies and with a lot of different people. So I think I've seen a fair spread, but I've never worked in Africa. I've never worked in South America. I've never worked in a bunch of different contexts, a bunch of different industries, a bunch of different places. So I think it's difficult for me to say canonically, here's the perfect blend. Now, what I would say is when I took the helm of the design team at Google X, it used to be split up by UX designers, design researchers, industrial designers, design strategists. And that siloing just didn't make sense at the type of projects that we were doing, which were very early, very speculative, very open-ended. And the boundaries between them just became really ossified and hard in a way that was really unhelpful. And what I found was by putting somebody that had come from an MBA background with an industrial designer, with somebody that's come from a more software background, together on something and saying, have a think about this subject area, whatever it was, the future of television or some sort of automated robotics. Like have a think about that together in the round and try and make sense of it together. And I think they naturally came at the same question from their own preferences. And then the project sort of developed around that. And you got that kind of diversity through the group work.
I see.
Makes sense.
Yeah. Keji?
Yeah, so I think you said just before this that our careers and education really shape what lens we might lean on. And so my question is, how do you suggest people to perhaps retrain themselves or grow out of a respective lens instead of rather than being stuck to what is?
Yeah, I mean, the long version is never stop learning, never stop being open to other ways of seeing things, learn a bit about every way of looking at the future. The shortcut is work with other people, like bring a bunch of other people together that you trust who can bring a different lens. That doesn't necessarily have to be like training and discipline, but just background and history and their own upbringing and their gender and their age, and like try and bring some different people in to ask the same sort of question and see if you get different answers. I think that's the way I found it working, because there's only so many hours in the day to train. I need to turn off my alarm. Hang on. Somebody's beeping me. I'll stop that. We got it.
So here might be a good place actually to pause and just see if there are any general questions. The next topic I'd like to talk about is design fiction, which is the last portion of the book. So, but are there any questions about the four categories? Julia?
Yes, hello from New York. Good to meet you guys and see everybody. I'm with you, Nick, on what you were saying earlier in terms of being gun shy around stressing a framework or a process, because then people get more fixated on following the steps of the process than actually thinking things through. However, I've really struggled to articulate, whether with a project team or a client, that, right? Like if it's like, okay, if we're not following a process or we're not following a framework, then what are we doing? And then you get into this, or I get into this hazy, like, well, it's critical thinking or reasoning or, just being smart. Like I'm wondering if you have any experience cracking that where I fumble.
Yeah, it's
yeah.
really familiar. I do get it, and I've found benefit in sort of, I wouldn't say pretending. I wouldn't go that far. Like following some sort of nominal phases or something. Certainly when I've been working as a consultant on the outside, people need that because you have to bill it and they have to say phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and you have to call it something.
Yeah.
I also appreciate my own privilege. Like I've worked in companies where I've either earned or been given a bit of trust and said, Nick sort of knows what he's doing, just follow him and things will work out all right, which again, bit of privilege, I get that. I think finding a way to let people, like working with people iteratively is really helpful if you could do that. If you can work with the same team over and over, you can kind of dispense with a lot of the performative side of doing futures work and just sort of get straight into the bit where you get the most value, whether that's the talking or the drawing or the prototyping or the whatever it is. So being able to work with the same group of people over and over, you have to do less of the performing. I think that's what I would say. That's not necessarily helpful, but I do think that this is where I get strident. I don't know quite what mix of people we've got on this call, but I'm a designer. I come from a designerly background. I see the world through sort of objects and people and the overlap of those things, and technology plays a big part in that now. And I just think design has gotten way too servile in the last 20 years and tried to please any number of other clients in a way that they don't try and please me. Like I'm not, when I work with a finance person, he doesn't have to outline his process to me. He just comes in and said it's 27%. And you're like, okay, I guess he knows what he's doing. And I worry that sometimes, maybe I'm starting a campaign here, but I worry sometimes design is so sort of scared of its own uncertainty that it tries to sort of build some fake certainty around it and some method and some framework and something else. And it all just sort of crumbles away, which sort of undermines the actual act of being a designer, which is uncertainty. And I think we should lean into that more and say, actually, that's our expertise. We've been doing this for, in my case, 25 years. Got a rough idea of what I'm doing. I don't need to prove it to you through a sort of diagram. Anyway, I'll get off my high horse now. But I feel like design has backed itself into a corner of trying to tell everybody else why it's valuable. And here's our method. And design thinking was a classic example of that, which I think on this call we can all agree has been a huge failure for our industry and absolutely brought down the level of respect that design's got. Because you can now do a 3-day course at Stanford online and be a design thinker. It's sort of nonsense.
Right.
Anyway.
Can you go into that a little bit more?
No, I just remembered. Okay. I just remembered we're recording. No, I'm joking. No, I feel strongly about this, and I'm sort of on record anyway about this. Designers spent too long trying to prove itself to other people, and the work should be the proof. I think design has definitely proved itself to be incredibly valuable on financial, on societal, on cultural, and on environmental levels for decades. I don't think we need to do any more kind of proof of method or here's my working. I just find that design's found itself in that place too much, and I don't want to play that game. So.
Sure. Yeah. And so does this play into your idea of design fiction then, like a method for exploration that is like maybe more has more tangible outcomes?
I mean, design fiction is one of the many things that I've lent on. I don't do it as much as I used to, and you have to deploy it very carefully because it doesn't yield the necessary answer. It just helps provoke people to think a little bit differently. And so my sort of larger dogma, I suppose, is this notion of the future mundane, which is trying to think about the future as a lived-in place. People will talk about robotics or they'll talk about self-driving cars. And I think being able to produce a quick artifact like a receipt or a quick start guide or whatever it is, those kinds of things can help people suddenly wrap their head around, oh yeah, I get what you mean now. Oh yeah, you would actually have to do that, wouldn't you? And it stops it being this sort of Minority Report science fiction up in the clouds for somebody else from some like far off heroes, and starts to bring it into sort of Marjorie and James's life and start to go, oh yeah, hang on, who would pay for that? How would you maintain that? So my larger dogma is probably the future mundane, this idea of trying to ground the future and make it feel like an evolution of the present, which is absolutely what it will be. There's no way of getting to the future without going through tomorrow and the weekend. Like, we've got to think about that. And most of us on this call will be around in 10 years' time, living that future. So let's talk about that. What about Julian in New York with his green t-shirt on? How's his life different? I think that matters more to me than showing some picture of a heart surgeon in VR doing some surgery. Like, I can't get my head around that.
Yeah. Yeah, you gave some examples in your book of sort of futuristic worlds that are very good at maybe extrapolating from the mundane, for instance, Black Mirror. And I think you said at the start of the book too that you're not like a huge fan of science fiction in general, I suppose, or.
I mean, yeah, this gets me in a lot of trouble because it's sort of heretical to work in futures work and say you don't get a lot out of science fiction. I like watching science fiction; it's good fun.
Mhm.
I didn't grow up liking it, and I don't really find it particularly useful. I'm being very broad here with my terms. In the work that I do, I don't reference it. And it makes me shudder a bit when people do, because I think what it usually represents is somebody not doing real thinking. They're just taking a placeholder from some movie or some TV show and saying, let's just make that, without sort of doing the proper translation or the proper thinking about what the future they're trying to actually create. So I'm not a big fan of science fiction. I've had a lot of people try to thrust books into my hands and recommend movies, and they're all interesting, but I firmly believe the primary function of science fiction is to entertain,
Mhm.
and I'll stand by that till the day I die. And I think
Mhm.
that's where a lot of people make a mistake when they say, let's make that thing from Minority Report. Now, there are works of what you might call science fiction or futuristic critique kind of work that is interesting. And I do like Black Mirror for that reason, where it will take a shift typically driven by something like a technology, but the story is about what that does to people and what it does to their hobbies and their habits and their relationships and the shape of their living room, and how boyfriends and girlfriends argue when this new thing exists. And it also understands the persistencies that go through. There are still bad sweaters and coat hangers and phone calls that come at the wrong time. And I think that's why things like Black Mirror, and even if I take some of the canonical sort of science fiction like Blade Runner, the first one, for example, it's sort of a fantasy story, really, technologically speaking. But the reason why it lands so well is because there are like rotten old leather jackets, and it rains, and there's sort of seedy noodle bars, and it sort of feels at least a little bit like an extension of the present, rather than a whole new world broken out of an egg that I'd somehow have to imagine myself into. So a lot of people love science fiction. A lot of people get a lot of benefit out of it. I think one of the challenges that we've got at the moment, particularly in Silicon Valley where I operate, is a lot of the people leading our organizations don't have the capability to adequately imagine the future. So they lean on these placeholders and just sort of want to make it real. And it limits the ideas that they're able to have and the language they're able to use to describe the future. And there are any number of examples, as some in the book, but any number we can reel off. There's a lot of reasons why I'm sort of nervous about that language finding its way into real product development and real sort of ambitions at a C-suite level. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me. That's another one of my high horses. They're all stacking up now.
Yeah, that's great. We'll have a nice pile by the end of this salon. When I read your comment about Black Mirror, like I was trying to figure out, like, is there something from like my something that from my own childhood, or that I've seen recently, that also has like these aspects of like the mundane.
Those are like
Uh,
the
sorry, let me mute
Some
Chris.
background. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Um,
Nice.
and but Black Mirror is generally dystopian. It's almost all dystopian, right? So there's something that's like a little bit more positive. And the thing that I could not get out of my head actually was this old Sylvester Stallone movie called Demolition Man.
Mm.
Um, and in it, like, it has this high concept, right? They've like thrown, Stallone is a cop in like present day who does he blows up a building or whatever. They put him to cryo sleep, and then they wake him up in the morning, or I'm sorry, not in the morning, in the future, way in the future, right? So it's got that kind of like high concept to it, but they sprinkle in like elements of like the mundane. It's done for laughs, but like some of these things I think like are a little bit clever or telling. There's an entire kind of scene about like he comes out of cryo sleep, and he has to use the bathroom, and he goes to the bathroom, but in the future they don't use toilet paper anymore. So he comes back out, and he has to like ask people like, what is, like, there are these seashells, what is that? And it's just this like comedic thing, like people are laughing like, oh my God, like he's from an era when like people use toilet paper. Like it's like such a, just kind of a small detail thrown in. And then there was another part where like as convicts, they in the future they want the people that they have put into cryosleep for committing crimes. They want them to come out with useful skills, and so they have this re-education program, which is basically as they're sleeping, they are being sort of taught how to do things. And Sylvester Stallone comes out like the computer has determined that he should really want to knit, and so he comes out with like this urge to like to like make sweaters and things. But it's like that's, it's done for laughs, but it is like this kind of an extension of like, oh yeah, yeah, like we do think about like, right, like what happens when someone comes out of prison and has to like re-enter society. It's like, like it's
Yeah, and I mean, you could substitute cryosleep for just waiting 5 years, like in that story. And I
right.
think that's the point that I'm making. And the reason it's funny is because we're encouraged not to think about that mundane stuff, about what
Hmm.
happens to chewing gum and what happens to, when you need your windows cleaning. Like I think that it's a critical failing of our ability to imagine the future is to push all of that aside and just look at the change and say, look at that, and that's it. Like a lot
Hmm.
of people will point just at change without thinking about either the consequences of that change or all of the stuff that's remained the same. you know and I think that to me is the next evolution of thinking about the future that most people need to make, because it's very easy to point at the one thing that's going to change and say, look at that, and sort of leave it at that. And that's most of what I like to push back against, because I don't know how many people we've got on this call that have actually built a thing in the real world from the scratch to the end. It's a whole lot of really boring details, like really ordinary things that you have to execute and get them done. But when we talk about the future, we just talk about that little bit of difference, and we forget all of the other stuff, like where do the screws go? How much does it cost? Where do I plug it in? Those are things that really matter. So if you want to tell vivid stories that you can engage with, you have to get involved at that level, and that takes way more effort and time and budget and people than most people are willing to throw at this kind of work.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Um, Yeah, that reminds me actually of the story of the Post-it note, where there was a chemist, I think at I think it's 3M.
3M, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, who's working on trying to develop an extremely strong glue, and was just failing and failing, and came up with a thing that was like very weird. It's like, it's pressure sensitive. It doesn't really stick very well, and like it just had like these strange properties. And he worked on this for, I don't, it was like 6 years or something like that. And he had like like a little, like he'd been putting it on various surfaces, and and he had it on like paper or something. And then a coworker was in church, and one day was opening I think a hymnal, right, to some page, and like his bookmarks kept falling out, and he realized, aha, if I could get the bookmark to stick to the page, this would actually be be great. And so he went back to his coworker, and they worked out like how to like actually productionize and industrialize this process. But I think it took them like another like 6 years or something like that. It was like such a like a small thing. Like I need a thing to show me where I should open my page to. That like the post-it note is like the basis for probably all of the designs, sorts of exercises and thinking that Nick, that you're down on, right?
I mean, yeah, I think so. Like the fact that I began my career as an actual engineer, I worked at Dyson in 1996 for the record. Many people weren't born. But like for the first 3.5, 4 months, I worked on the design of a little polypropylene cage that held a filter to protect the motor for the fan. That's all I did. And it was really hard, and I learned a load. But just understanding that there were like 200 people like me, each working on a little bit of a casing of a housing of a thing, just to make a vacuum cleaner for many, many, many months. Like that understanding of what it takes to make something is what frustrates me when people talk about the future and just sort of do this. Not
Mhm.
that it's like you have to have everything fixed or solved, or I'm not trying to compress ambition or the idea, big thinking. But then what? Like what? So really great idea, love it. Let's spend the next 800 hours talking about all the details. I'm like, I can't be bothered. I want to do something else. I think that's the problem I have with an awful lot of kind of futures work, is it just sort of wanders in and kind of goes, oh, I don't know, this
Mhm.
thing.
Right.
And as soon as somebody finds something interesting, they just kind of don't know what to do. And I think that's the part where it's like, okay, if this is an interesting idea, let's start thinking about it in more detail. And I just don't see a lot of that in a lot of futures work. And it's not just, industrial design or product design. I'm not even just talking to designers. A lot of people I've worked in sort of strategic foresight, and a lot of people I've seen work in financial foresight. Any kind of futures discipline has this habit of being remarkably vague. And then whenever you press for detail, you realize there's not a lot there.
Mhm.
My one of the lines that I'm very fond of in the book, I think design has been compressed under the weight of corporate strategy for a long time, and a lot of people from sort of MBA strategy backgrounds. And there's this sort of belief in numbers and projections of numbers that I think is just so misplaced and so vague and so hard to defend, because as soon as that solid line turns to a dotted line, it stops being data and becomes a story. But because it's a story told with numbers as opposed to my stories that are told with images or words, they're somehow more believable. Like, I don't know, like when I'm drawing these things, I'm thinking an awful lot about what they might mean and what they might lead to and how we might make them and how much it might cost. So I think we need to get to that level of parity where we know we're all telling stories, but everybody's using a different medium. And that has an inherent level of uncertainty in it. And what I'm keen to do is add as much to that pile to bring some more detail and believability and reality to it. That's what I'm interested in.
Yeah.
Sorry, again, strident me. It's getting punchy. I'm on my third Diet Coke of the day. I'm getting a bit punchy.
Yeah. I think one of the really like fun things that you talked about in your book, and I've seen in like other writings from you, is this this example of the cereal box, right? As a design exercise. Can you talk about that? Like, there's quite a lot that that comes out of that. Yeah.
I mean, a cereal box, you could pick anything. I think one of the things that I'm trying to do when I do that kind of work is, so to give some context, Wes, when talking about the future, it's very easy to talk about the thing rather than the implications of the thing. We sort of mentioned that before. And what I mean by that is, if we're talking about robotics or we're talking about the future of some big tech thing, VR or whatever, it's easy just to draw that thing and talk about that thing. But if it's truly adopted at mass scale and it's truly a very successful product or project or technology, it'll have effects across thousands of other things. And so what I like to do is take something like a cereal box or a tin of tomatoes or something and look at it. Like, if you unpeel the label off a tin of tomatoes, for example, there's maybe 100 tells on there, 100 little signals of the state of the world on there. And I'm serious when I say 100. There's the actual physicality of the thing, the state of the art with what you can print with. There's the type of language that's used, which tells you the shape of slang, the shape of the population balance of a country. There's tons of stuff like weights and measures and standards. There's legal stuff, there's barcodes, there's QR codes, there's the CMYK registration tool. Like, there's tons of things on that simple thing, like a label on a can of tomatoes, that lets you know what the state of the world is at the moment. So if you project forwards any number of years or inject a new technology, how will all of those things change and which ones will remain the same? And I think just by changing them and then rebuilding a tin of tomatoes and saying, in this world that you're talking about with ubiquitous domestic robots, for example, whatever that is, here's a tin of tomatoes. Have a look at that. And then you sort of notice the things and you can start to argue and say, well, why is that different? Why is that changed? Well, because of this. And, these systems use whatever it is, LiDAR scanning, and they work in a slightly different way. And what you'll find is the majority of the tin of tomatoes remains the same, but there'll be tiny little things, if you really think about it, that might change. There'll be slight little differences. And you can also start to bring in things that aren't robotics, that might be about trends that are changing in diet, trends that are changing in how long people live, whatever it is. And you can play those out in this very sort of ordinary, mundane, grounded way through making something like a box of cereal, a tin of tomatoes. And sometimes you do it as a bit of in a lot of the meetings that I've been in big tech companies, sometimes just doing one of those over the weekend and plopping it on the table on Monday morning, when it feels like the conversation's getting a bit out of hand and a bit fantastical, just doing that and saying, that might exist in the world that we're talking about. It sort of grounds everyone and stops everyone getting a little bit too out of their own depth. So I found that to be a really useful thing. And it's not the work itself, I think. It's something just to keep the work on track and keep everyone focused on real conversations as opposed to sort of losing their way a bit into the ether.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? It's quite a difficult sort of concept unless you can work through an exact example, but
right, yeah,
it's definitely
it does make sense. Yeah, it's in film, it's almost like a MacGuffin. It's like, right, like it's a thing that kind of like drives the conversation or the story forward, but it's slightly
different than a MacGuffin, but yes, it's so MacGuffin is that Hitchcock term for it doesn't really matter what it is. Like Marcellus Wallace's case in Pulp Fiction is a MacGuffin. You don't know what's in it, but it's important and people want it. So that's sort of what I think. Maltese Falcon is another example of that, but that's a Hitchcock version. I think what I'm talking about is more like a prop. And if you actually, I love, I don't know whether anyone else does, when you see sometimes the sort of production design manuals from big movies, and you start to realize how much the production team, how much time they spent thinking about things that were barely even on screen, little sort of in jokes or little references that just ground the story a little bit more. I love stuff like that. And I think, they're really quick things to make, and you can just throw something together pretty quickly. And people suddenly think about that world in a slightly different, more relatable way, perhaps. If it looks like the breakfast they had before they came to work and now it's in front of them, they start to embrace that change a little bit better, I think.
Yeah. Kaji, do you have a question?
Yeah, something just came to mind as you were describing the cereal box where the can of tomatoes is. Do you feel like you're working backwards from this imaginary future object and telling this story, or are you kind of going forward and layering on trends onto today, or is it like a mix of both? Yeah,
a really good question, actually. Bit of both, I think. And I think what I mean by that is I'm a big proponent of actually building a thing, like actually making a prototype. We can all either go into Photoshop or fire up some generative AI tool and say, make me a box of cereal from the future. I think when you're confronted by all of those different elements that I talked about, and you have to say, will that stay the same? Will it exist? Will it be different? And if so, how? You actually have to put something in the Illustrator file or the InDesign file or whatever it is you're using and make a conscious decision and ask yourself a question. Hang on, will there be URLs in this future we're talking about? Yeah, I think there will. And then you've made a decision. Will there still be high fructose corn syrup in the ingredients list in this future? Oh, that's actually a good question. We should talk about that a bit more. And it just, the act of actually physically having to produce something and have it really there. You can't just leave a gap or let the system fill it in somehow. You actually have to make a decision. And I think forcing yourself to have that conversation about stupid things like, will this box of cereal be grams or ounces? Like, what will happen to weights and measures in the future? We were joking before in the sort of green room beforehand about the USA still being on kind of imperial measurements. And when you're making a box of cereal from the future, does that continue or not? And it might not be small. It might be small. It might be inconsequential, but it does help you wrap your head and your arms around the world a bit more. So a bit of a combination of the both, actually. Like a future that we're talking about is the provocation, and then delivering the object or delivering the description is sort of backfilling it and making those extra decisions.
Got it. Yep. And so by that account, do you feel like the future is more anchored in prototyping for that reason too? Just because like as we're built, there are a lot of micro decisions we just cannot avoid.
Say that question again, just so I make sure I understand it.
So like with your example of designing a future like cereal box and even understanding whether or not the US will stay in imperial units, but that's still, I guess you mentioned that, hey, like I still need to create sort of a prototype. And because there's this physical act of making the prototype, there are a lot of these micro decisions that we just cannot avoid. And so do you feel like as we are thinking of the future, we have to kind of force ourselves to make these micro decisions and anchor it into these future prototypes?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that as a designer. I see the world through these things. It's the language I use to explore and communicate the future. And so I think prototyping is a big part of that. And I don't just want to get too obsessed by the soup cans and the cereal boxes.
Yeah.
Like it can be writing can be prototyping too, or making little films or building a real thing that sort of works. I'm a big fan of prototyping as a way to sort of ground a conversation. Because I think, again, a lot of people that work in the future space, not just designers, but everybody, has a habit of sort of not really getting into it. And I think making a prototype of something makes you get into it, makes you really say, well, what do you mean? Like, show me a little 3-second clip of somebody doing what you say will happen in the future. And then something will suddenly stand out and be like, well, hang on, that doesn't make sense. That doesn't look right. What are you talking about? And I think that's the sort of first step towards rigor that I'm interested in. and just trying to build that sort of communal desire to push people harder to say, well, what do you mean? What do you mean? What do you mean? Like, show me more. I think we just put up with so much underpowered futures work from everybody, from everywhere, from our media, from our news, from our experts, from our advisors. It's all just sort of, we're encouraged as audiences to sort of sit back and nod and be like, wow, that's clever. And not actually just put your hand up and say, well, what do you mean? I don't get it. You know, there's that scene in Big, the Tom Hanks movie. I might be dating myself a bit here, but he's a child that gets put in an adult's body and he gets a job working for a toy firm, and he's in this meeting room and somebody shows him a transformer type product of a building that changes into a robot, and everyone around the room's saying, oh, this is amazing, it's going to be great for Christmas, we should launch this product, and he just says, I don't get it. And I think all of us, when we're in rooms being told what the future is or what we should do or what the future's going to hold or what it's going to be like, just be that Tom Hanks and say, well, what do you mean? I don't get it. Like, tell me more. Give me more reason to get on board with this. I don't get it. And I think the reason why, how many is this? 4 high horses of the day. The reason why I don't like calling myself a futurist is because I think the output of a lot of futurists is so subpar. I don't want to be part of that team. And the reason it's so subpar is because the people consuming their work don't hold it up to account enough and don't ask enough hard questions of it. They go to their conferences, they have the person stand on stage and tell them the future's all robots and lasers. Everyone applauds, so they go and have their canapes, and then the person sends an invoice and goes and does it again the next week. And I think that's why a lot of the work we see from futures work just sort of gets dismissed as this kind of whimsical, nonsensical, fantastical, big statistics, big dotted lines, big change, big robots, big this. And I don't know, it just doesn't feel like it helps. I don't want to be part of that community. Another high horse.
Julian?
Well, I'll get on a high horse and relieve you of the horses
Duty.
or whatever.
Do it.
But a lot of what you're saying is resonating with me. I think that a lot of the futurist conferences that I've been to that I haven't appreciated or such, it seems like, and clients who applaud some of the sexy future work, but not maybe the more meaningful. I think I find that it's because people lose sight of the purpose of futures work, right? Where as you know, a lot of futurists do futures work because it's sexy and it's like, oh wow, look, and as you say, fantastical, like whoa. But what is the point of that work? Right? Like if the point is to make decisions today or to work towards some certain future, then the future becomes more mundane, to use your language, and forces a little bit more rigor in the way that I think you appreciate.
I could just be an arch pragmatist, but one thing I want to be really clear on. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Julian.
No.
I also appreciate that the future is a completely unwritten space, and we can and we sort of should think big and be ambitious and be broad and be ambitious, like I said, and have those crazy ideas. I think that's all of our jobs. But then what? Like, you can't just walk out the room and say, there you go, guys, it's all going to be robots. Have a good afternoon. It feels useless. I think it's fine to have those big dreams and those big ambitions. And I love meeting people that have that energy, that could futurist like minds. We could do this thing. Wow. Great. Right. We got 1,000 questions. Let's get going. Like, let's figure those out. What does tomorrow look like? What does next week? What does next month look like? How much does it cost? Who's going to make it? Who's going to be left behind? It just builds. But what you find is a lot of that stuff gets parceled up and it gets either released at CES or a World's Fair or a conference or, at a end of year offsite thing, whatever. And it just sort of sits there and it doesn't change a lot. So if we do truly want to change the world with ambitious futures work, it has to lead to something next, has to plug into some of the ongoing work that we're doing now, I think. So I'm not trying to compress or denigrate like big ambitious futures work at all. I like to be part of that too. I worked at a company that had that sort of mantra of trying to do these big kind of impossible things, but very quickly it turns into very pragmatic questions. Like, what's the technology? Does it work? Can we make it work? Can we afford to make it work? Who's on the team? Do we have enough headcount? Do we have enough budget? Can we make, And I think that pragmatism has to follow immediately after any bold statement about the future. Otherwise, it is just schoolboy picture book stuff.
Yeah, I think the main criticism, I suppose, that would come to mind for me is that like too much of a focus on the mundane is maybe uh, will push us into too incremental of a of a world improvement. But what I'm hearing you saying though is that it's actually it's like the other half of the coin, let's say, right? That there has to be there is big thinking, but in order for big thinking to be helpful, it has to be tethered to some kind of reality. Is that right?
Kind of. I think one thing that we shouldn't ignore as well is the world that we're living in at the moment is the result of a lot of accidental big thinking or non-thinking. Like the massive changes that we're sort of struggling to wrap our arms around, climate change being the big one, is the result of not enough sort of embracing the mundanity. And these big changes accidentally happen. And I think the reason that I'm trying to encourage people to think about the future as a lived-in place that evolves from the present, again, it's not to hold down on be incremental. It's to say we can have these big changes, but we need to figure out how people and hobbies and habits and a round of golf at the weekend and picking up the kid, all that stuff has to fit in around it, even if it is a big thing. I gave a talk last week in London where I talked about all the things that have changed since I was born. And when you look back on it, it's nuts. There were no MRI machines when I was born. The population was less than half of what it is today. I'm not an old man, really. I'm not young, but I'm not old. You could smoke cigarettes on planes. Children didn't have to wear seatbelts in cars. Gay marriage wasn't legal anywhere on earth when I was born. Berlin Wall was still standing. These are massive changes, but it doesn't really feel like I'm living in the future because it just sort of creeps up. And I've went to the bakery this morning and my knee still hurts. I think that's what I'm talking about embracing the reality and the future as a lived experience. Doesn't mean to say we can't have massive change, but humans are really pliable and we fit ourselves around massive change. I think has anyone taken a Waymo self-driving taxi thing? Yeah, I'm sure a couple of people have.
I just did a couple months ago. Yeah.
Yeah. First time you take it, it's like, whoa, because it fulfills all those sci-fi wet dreams that we've had. And then the second time you take it, it's kind of like, oh yeah. Yeah. And then the third time, oh, it's a bit late, and it very, very quickly, like that's a huge technological achievement and undoubtedly a step change in many things from robotics and autonomy, and legal systems have had to change significantly to allow that to happen. And yet now a lot of people who live around my neck of the woods, they just sort of don't even think about it. They just get in a car to go to dinner. What are we going to have? Oh, we're going to go to that Mexican place. Let's do that. So big changes can happen. Humans are very pliable. We fit around them. And I think that's what I'm talking about, as opposed to saying everything has to be incremental and small.
Yep.
Keji?
Yeah, Nick, you mentioned that we've been talking about how the mundane fits around these breakthroughs, but also a lot of big breakthroughs like the internet with ARPANET or the GPS has happened because the government funded them long before that mundane fit was clear. And the government, unlike corporations, don't constantly have this protocol to have immediate returns for shareholders. Like I'm curious how you think they might have a special role in the future, planting these seeds while designers, engineers, product people work out maybe the other mundane details later.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's one that I'm not brilliantly placed to answer, to be frank. But I understand exactly what you're saying. I mean, NASA and the space race is the classic example that people quote, where it's like the government just said, we're going to do this thing. We're going to throw a bunch of money at it. Away you go. ARPANET, same thing. I get it. I think it's very difficult to talk about this without getting into sort of political tricky water. But one of the things I will say is, I think, and please bear with me as I'm sort of treading a bit delicately around this, but one of the things that I think we've all noticed is that we've all become aware that the future is a little bit more important than perhaps we thought of when we were children, and we're sort of trying to figure it out a bit more. But it's rare that we hear about generational investment programs or multi-generational projects anymore. And I think it's sort of strange, that dichotomy, that everyone's sort of more and more obsessed and uncertain and a bit queasy about the future. And if you look at Google searches for what will the future be like, they've kind of tripled since 2020. So everybody's sort of got this feeling of uncertainty about the future. You'd expect that leads to an acknowledgement of that, and at a sort of government and a leadership level, a longer term, hey, this is where we're all headed, everyone, just take it easy. Like, this is the sorts of things we're interested in. We're going to invest in the next 50 years in this thing. We're going to build a country that looks like this. But because sort of politics has moved into a very near term, not even a tenure by tenure or a leadership by leadership thing, but by like a quarterly or weekly or even daily or hourly news cycle, I think it's just become really unusual and infrequent for us to hear about these longer term ambitious investment things like we might have done in the 60s or the 80s, let's say. And the sort of uncomfortable truth that I talk about a little bit in the book is that those long term plans are now mostly found in sort of dynastic autocratic countries where they don't have to worry too much about keeping in power or the next election cycle, and they can do these 50, 100-year investment ideas because they don't have, they can sort of get going with them and go through the peaks and troughs. So again, it is quite tricky sort of territory politically that I don't necessarily want to be on too much record about, but I do feel like that's a tension. We're really struggling to make these generational level investments and build these longer term stories about where we're all heading when the rest of our world is so stochastic and changeable, even at a political level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my view on those sorts of plans, China does like the 5-year plans, right? Is that it's I'm like how do you put it, like sort of like I don't put like a value judgment on it necessarily. I see it as as like a kind of like long-term mechanism, but it means that it could be a good long-term outcome, but it could also be a bad long-term outcome. Right. You just you put in place like something like a 5, 10-year plan, and if you really stick to it, there's a chance that after 5, 10 years, like you've just done something even like worse than if like your outlook was only 1 year out or something, right? But there also is a chance that you do something right, like much better. So.
Yeah, it is difficult territory to get too into, but I do think that there's a vacuum there and a lack of continuity to sort of say, I don't really know, I sort of represent 2 major countries. I've got passports for the UK and the US. And if I look at those countries, I don't really know what they want to be, like really at a sort of detailed level in 50 years time. I don't quite know at a technological, societal, cultural level what they're trying to point towards, what the big ambitions are of these countries. And I'm not saying it has to be there and we have to rigorously stick to it, but it'd be nice to hear something. Like, it'd be nice to hear some sort of like, this is generally where we'd like to be by this time, and I think it's achievable, so let's go. But you don't tend to hear a lot of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If somebody came to you and was like, Nick, we'd like for you to set a 5-year plan. Let's say for a corporation, not for a full country. What would your approach be?
I mean, there's so many variables in that question. It's almost hard to know where to start. I mean, I certainly wouldn't. I'd always get very suspicious about a single person delivering a vision for an organization, just because an organization of any size inflicts change in so many different directions. At some point, somebody does have to say, I own this and it's mine. I'm president or CEO or something. I don't think that should be me. I can contribute my bit to it, and I would try my best. If I was trying to manage my bit of it, I'd try and look at all of the coulds and the shoulds and the mights and the don'ts and be responsible about that, saying, I think this is what we could do. There's a really exciting territory there, and I'm excited about it, and my team's excited about it for these reasons. I think we should go here because that's either the safest, or it'll give the biggest return, or it'll achieve what you've said we want to achieve. Might do these things, so these things might happen, and that might happen, and they might do this over there, and that might mean that we have to do this and take a different strategy. And on all the don't stuff, like we should be really careful about this. We should avoid that stuff if we can. We should stop doing this. And so that's what I mean about a kind of rounded way of proposing a future. But just getting up on stage and saying it's all robots or it's all AI, it's it's all nonsense, isn't it? It doesn't help. So yeah, I think, and get a diversity of people building that in there. And that's not just me dropping the diversity bomb just to sort of piece out, but I think it really does help make stories about the future richer and more rounded. And I'm talking about diversity of everything. But yeah, I think that's the sort of mealy mouthed version of what I think you were asking for, which is, yeah, just try and look at it in the breadth and keep doing the work and revisit those ideas every sort of quarter or every year and say, is it still hold true? Is this still where we want to point? Is this still as interesting as we thought it was? So it's a living, like I think Bruce Sterling said, the future is a verb, not a noun. Like it's a process, not a destination. I really like that. I think that's a really good way of thinking about time. Time is just a process. It's not a place. Does that make sense? It feels a bit philosophical there, but I think it does help. It helps me anyway.
Yeah. So I thought, maybe we can pause here and just see if, are there any questions?
I actually asked the same question for your personal, like how do you approach that the same way? Because you're owning the goal of your life, right? So I'm curious what's your process? Yeah.
You were breaking up a little bit, so maybe if I paraphrase and you can give me a thumbs up if you think it was the right thing. So it's about me taking control of my own personal future and my own goals and that kind of thing, right?
How do you approach? Yeah.
Good question. And I think, has this turned into a BetterHelp call now? Is this my therapist? I struggle with the idea of a grand master plan for my own life just because it's been a bit of a pinball ride so far. I think having sort of ambitions or ideas is important about sort of things I might like to try and achieve and the kind of life I'd like to lead. But it concerns me when I meet younger people who say, by 26, I want to be this, and by 32, I want to do this, and by 44, I need this in my life. I think it stops you taking chances and making hard left turns and just taking opportunity. I never planned to live in America. It was never, I grew up around American culture and hip hop and skateboarding and all that stuff was great when I was growing up in a wet town in Derby. But I never planned on moving here. It's just that the opportunity came up and I talked to my wife and said, this is a thing we could do. Let's do that. Okay, let's do that. And it worked out great and it's been fun, but you never know the chances you didn't take. I could have ended up doing something completely amazing in Germany. I don't know. So it's a bit of a loose answer, but I'm 50 in February, and that's a classic moment when you kind of look back on your life and you buy a Porsche and you have a bit of a crisis. And I'm in that spot right now. So I am thinking about it, but I think as I come to terms with my own mortality more, having less of a plan and just enjoying the act of doing the stuff that you like to do is more important to me than saying, I need to have this by this, whatever it is, an amount of money in the bank or an asset or a particular job title or whatever. I like the idea of just focusing on the things you really love and really get a kick out of. And that gets a little narrower and narrower as you get older. And I'm very comfortable with where I am in that at the moment. Is that helpful? I feel like I sort of waffled around your question, but it is sort of the truth.
Harry, did you have a question?
Hey, Nick. Yeah. I wanted to ask you if you, any of the kind of futures work you did, maybe say 10 years ago, whether you've gone back and, maybe re-examine the could, should, might, don'ts of that, and whether some of the predictions not predictions, some of the design work that you did has basically how it's actually turned out.
Yeah, it's a good question. There's a strong line in the book actually about predictions, and I don't know whether I'm just this person that likes to push back against the status quo, but whenever I meet people and they find out what I do for a living, one of the first things they ask me is for a prediction. Like, well, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? I don't know. I spend a little bit of my time thinking about this stuff, but it is all guesses and stories at the end of the day. I think the one thing I will say is one of the big transitions that happened in my life was realizing that I was sort of play acting the futurist. And I talked about that a bit earlier, where I was sort of doing the thing I thought you were supposed to do and getting clients excited and drawing the whiz-bang stuff and keeping on top of the tech trends and all that stuff. And it just felt like, cosplay. It didn't feel good. So that was the first transition. I think also having done this now for 25 years, a little bit of humility and a bit of honesty about what you don't know, and knowing that everything that you were certain about and absolutely confident about back in 2009, sort of some of it came true, some of it didn't. And so you realize that you're not in the business of making predictions. You're just in the business of helping people think. And when something feels like it's interesting, building on that and trying to make it real. That's sort of it. That's what I think being a futurist is in my world anyway. So yeah, I think one of the things, again, I write about in the book, this is not supposed to be a huge trailer or a teaser for buying the book, by the way, but please do, is that, we all, the story that I tell is every city in the world has a kind of 80s night music at nightclubs, right? You go out and everyone dresses in neon and they dance to Rick Astley and it's really funny. But we forget the fact that people are going to do that for 2025s in 2035. And it'll still be funny and people will be listening to all the stuff we think is really cool right now and really interesting and really on the money right now. And I think the same thing of our ideas about the future. We will look back at them in 10 years' time and be like, how stupid were we? How naive this stuff was. Look how silly. They were still obsessed with like streaming movies. That's so dumb. Like, why were we ever bothered about that? I don't know. I'm just making stuff up. But I think that level of honesty and openness to being really wrong a lot of the time makes you a better practitioner. It's much better than being a certain person, because you can only do that about 5 or 6 times before people smell a rat.
Do you have any favorite predictions of the future by other people that you think were like highly prescient or like said something or or wildly off?
No, none.
No.
I hate predictions. I think I'm just pushing back harder than perhaps I should. Because I think that there's a lot of like these professional futurists who, I won't drop a name, but there's one in particular that quotes some sort of 93% accuracy in my predictions all over LinkedIn every week. It's just nonsense, absolute nonsense. Because like right or wrong are so vague, because the work is so vague. You can kind of say, there's all this classic stuff again from science fiction where somebody in 2001 will be holding a rectangle and everyone went, iPad. They predicted the iPad. And it's just sort of, and they'll ignore the 25,000 other things that were in movies that year for that one moment that looks a little bit like something we live with today. And so I just sort of push back against predictions a lot, like wherever I can. I think, and especially like predictions that are far out. Like I can kind of predict mostly what I think will happen tomorrow. I think in my house, in my life, maybe still could be very wrong. Like something really odd could happen. So this idea of predicting the way the world will be in 2030 it just feels like a waste of everyone's time. Having ambitions, having ideas, having desires, having guesses, that's fine. Predictions, we should leave that in our mystical past. We don't need tarot cards and Nostradamus anymore.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that there are certain kinds of disciplines or fields that are more like amenable, I guess, to your sort of futurist thinking? Or?
I mean, if you know any, let me know. I don't know. I don't want to come across as this sort of curmudgeon who's pushing back against everything. I just feel very passionately that this is we're living in a time when people are clearly queasy about the future and uncertain and cautious and anxious and excited and all those other things. And yet the stuff that the people who are professionally working in this space, are delivering to those people by means of answer just feels really underpowered and inadequate. And that bothers me, because I think we can do better quite easily without a lot of extra effort or work. Like just try to up level 10% the quality and the rigor and the depth of the work that we're doing to answer these genuine questions that people have about what is all this, where is it all going? And I can do that from one way, which is talk to other futurists and say, come on, we should get better. I think the stronger thing is to tell the audience to be a better consumer of futures work and ask harder questions, and don't be afraid to sit there in the audience at the conference and say, hey, hang on a second, tell me more about that again. And you'll often realize there's not a lot there. And I think that's the challenge to the people. That's the reason I wrote a kind of layperson's plain language book, as opposed to a book for other foresight practitioners or other people in the field. Because you end up just talking to the same 200 people and everyone sort of nods and goes, yeah. I wanted to write a book that hopefully anyone with a curious mind could pick up and read and make sense of and start to feel a bit more empowerment. Like, hang on, yeah, I've got thoughts on this actually. Like I went to a thing the other week, or this person at work said a thing. I want to know more about that. Like, it doesn't feel like they've thought about this enough. And I think that's how the tide line of that work just goes up and up and up, is if the customer, which is all of us, gets more demanding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It seems like this book has been quite a long time coming, right? It's
yeah. I mean, in my brain, probably my whole career is poured into this book. In reality, like nearly 2 years of writing. Yeah, which is very, very slow. I don't recommend doing that. But yeah, nearly 2 years.
Right. Yeah.
I'm kind of proud. I'm more proud of it than I was when it came out. I think the amount of feedback that I've got that's been positive has been really nice from people that aren't practicing foresight people or futures people or technical people even. I think people have found that they've found an affinity. Like, yeah, I've always felt like I've had ideas about the future or questions, but felt sort of unable or not allowed to ask them.
Sure. Do you think that you'll go back to a design agency, or like another moonshot factory? Or
yes, I do. I think there's a temptation when you write a book like this to become that sort of TED Talk LinkedIn guru guy who posts every sort of 3 days this top takes, and you can make a living off that, and people do, and it's fine. And you can be an external consultant as well. That's actually quite good work. But I think to really be effective, particularly in the kind of stuff that I'm interested in, which is breakthrough technologies and really genuinely new computer-based technologies typically, I think you have to be in the work. You have to be sitting there with the scientists and the engineers. And I think if you've got a known end date when the project comes to an end or the budget runs out or whatever, I think it shapes the work in a sort of unhealthy way. So I personally would love to be back inside a large technical organization rather than sort of become a professional commentator on the outside. I just think it's more fun. It's more fun to be in it and being able to talk to people. Like when I was at Google X, one of my proudest projects was working on, a nuclear fusion project. Like something I know nothing about, didn't go to school for it, haven't got a PhD in physics, I don't know anything. But sitting there with those people who had spent their lives trying to figure this stuff out and trying to convert it and using metaphors and trying to find language that was common between us and trying to understand what they were excited about. Like, I get it now. Okay, cool. So that's just lovely. That's nice to be around, and that's nice to sort of, it's good stimulation for your imagination for the future. And it becomes very academic and a bit false and fake quite quickly on the outside. So,
yeah. I spent almost 7 years at the Media Lab at MIT, and actually we have Roz is on this call. She's faculty there, and it's a like you were saying before, like like having a diversity of like people to interact with, like is like it's a true asset. And that is like one of the things that I found about the Media Lab is just the range of people and different sort of intellectual pursuits. At some point I was I had an office, and on one side of me was somebody who was working on CRISPR and gene editing, and then on the other side of me, somebody who was looking at technology, like like satellite space technology, right? And like having all of these people in close proximity in the same building is it's a lot of fun, and is very intellectually stimulating. One of the problems with the whole setup, though, I think is I mentioned before, it's like these sort of like institutional structures, or like the ways that things are kind of constructed, right? Like most of the researchers at the Media Lab are master students, so they're around for 2 years. There's some PhD students as well, so they're around for 6 years. There's some research staff that's that's the kind of stuff that I was doing, and it was but like the kind of impermanence of of the talent there defines the sort of work that comes out of it, as well as like the actual output is to do research, not to necessarily put a thing in people's hands, right?
I
So
think
the
that's
Media Lab
right.
like really tries there are lots of structures in which like people can spin out companies that actually get something in people's hands, but it's hard, you know.
Yeah, and I think the other thing as well is this thinking about the future is a discipline in itself, and it's not for everybody. I'm not going to make that Tim Brown mistake and say like everyone's a designer, everyone's a futurist. Like by some eyes, everyone's got an eye on the future and a desire to shape it some way. I get that. But actually to do the work, it's really unrewarding. There's very few KPIs or ROIs. You can't put a dollar amount to a piece of futures work almost ever, because either the thing you do stops somebody doing something, or it doesn't make it out the door. Or if it does, the work that you did is so far in the past by the time it makes it to shipping that people forget about it. So it's very difficult to justify this type of work. And it's just not for everybody. You know, I've worked with people in the past who desperately love to get something out into the world. And the truth about futures work is vast majority of it doesn't. And it's the doing, the thinking that counts. And it's not for everybody. And I think that's something we should acknowledge as well. It's some people are good at it, some people are bad at it, some people like doing it, some people actually don't like doing it. They'd much rather be in a little bit nearer, a little bit tighter, a little bit more constrained. No, there's no stink on what I'm saying at all. It's great. Like some people love automotive engineering, some people love thinking about the future. And I think that to me is finding those people and finding that balance in the team. It does take a lot of work, I get it. But I would love, like, one of the provocations, I'm going to the House of Lords next week in London to have a conversation about how we talk about the future to young people in classes and in education. And it's sort of strange that we don't teach the future as a subject. And I know that's very sort of loose. Like we teach physics and we teach maths and we teach English and we teach literature. We teach history, but we don't teach future. And we don't encourage children to wrap their heads around the concept of the future. And if you talk about the future to young people, very, very young people, it's still very escapist work, good futurism, lots of robots and flying cars and fantasy dreams from storybooks and science fiction. And as they get older and into their teens, unfortunately, what we're seeing is this ambient adolescent apocalypticism creeping in, which is fear and dread about the future and concern about where we're all heading. But we don't sort of encourage young people to wrap their heads around the future as a real thing, as a place that they will live in and own and run. You know, young people will be in charge of my healthcare quite soon. Like, it's important that they learn how to deal with that responsibility, that idea, that notion of the future as a body of work. And I can't stress how much that concerns me, that we don't encourage children to think. Children's a loose term, like younger people, to think about the future in those terms. We don't teach it at school.
Yeah, I actually I sat in last semester on a class that Roz led on how to think about the future, and so it is. Yeah, I agree with you. Like it is a a thing that right that deserves more conversation. Roz, do you want to comment on anything?
Hi, sorry, I've had my camera off. I'm trying to run around and listen at the same time.
No worries.
But it's very interesting. Yeah, so Nathan Barzi and I and Sherry Turkle teaching with us this spring too have been trying to get people to do exactly what you're saying, to envision what is a better future. And not just to do it in an abstract, I want to write a best-selling science fiction book or just entertain way, but to actually dovetail it with the research that they're doing at MIT or Harvard and step back and have a little support and being very critical about the kinds of assumptions that are being made and not just on their own, like against their professor saying, why are we doing it that way? But to have some structure or philosophical or other support for how they're examining things. So I'm curious, because I haven't read your book, what you would recommend for us in teaching these young people.
That's a good question. I wouldn't be so impertinent as to recommend anything to somebody of your esteem. But I do think that one of the things that I've been sort of dealing with, and I'm writing a piece at the moment about this, is this ease with which we deploy the term better. I think Alexandra Daisy Ginsburg wrote a PhD on the notion of better and how it just basically is a cover for our ideological beliefs. And a lot of us walk into a room at work and we say, this would be better, that'd be better, this would be a better world.
Well, anything's optimal with the right criteria, right? It all comes down to what are your criteria for that.
and encouraging people to really interrogate their own ideologies that sit underneath it. You know, most of these companies that I've worked for have a mission statement, and the mission statement often is about making a better world or a radically better place. But there's not a lot of conversation about what does the better mean and what does it look like. And I think that, you know all of this, Roz, of course, but this sort of ability to really, because people then just jump straight into solutions and ideas. We should do this, we should do this, we should do this. And actually, you just assume that everyone around the table shares the same end goal as you. And the truth is, it's really, really hard to guarantee that. Certainly in my job, where I'd be in a room with a sort of puffy vested venture capital type person, a veteran computer scientist with a recumbent bike, a designer, a kind of countercultural sort of post hippie person, somebody from finance, you know, whatever it was. And so whenever we're talking about creating this thing and everyone's like, that's a better thing, I think it's really hard to just get like 7 nods around the table and say, yep, we all agree. We're all trying to build the same thing here. So I'm rambling now, but I do think that that's a sort of one level down that we need to get to before we start saying we're all trying to achieve the same thing, right? Because I don't think that shared goal is even there in most of the meetings I've been in. And I think that's a challenge.
Well, I think that's a great place for us to close out the salon.
Look at the time. Yes.
Yeah, it's just about 8 here. Yeah, Nick, thank you for all of your time and you know the wonderful discussion. What is the best way for us to follow your work?
I'll give you that in a second. One thing I would like to say is I've been really trying to be really honest in all of these things I've been doing in promoting the book, and I hope you appreciate that all of these are ideas in flux, and I'm forming them as I'm delivering them as well. So I don't want to just give you platitudes and talk about just promoting the book. So hopefully that level of honesty is appreciated. But yeah, the best way to follow me is obviously things like LinkedIn and reasonably active on Instagram, I guess. nickfosterrdi.com. You can go there and everything sort of links from there. But yeah, I think what I'm really calling for, if I'm calling for anything, is just an appreciation of how important it is to think about the future for all of us, how important right now especially, and how underpowered all of our abilities to do that are. And perhaps now is a good time to rethink that and ask some complicated questions and have some strong opinions.
Yeah, that sounds like some wise advice. Thank you so much.
Kind. It's been really nice. Thanks everyone for giving your time. It's lovely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nick.
everyone.
Appreciate it.
That was great.
Thank you so much.